But and I certainly believe in the scientific method, but I didn't quite see how those questions related to the whole scientific endeavor. But anyhow, it's your book to write, so however I can assist you, I'm happy to do.
I'm thinking of science is in terms of having a hypothesis, doing experiments, collecting data, seeing if they're valid, making the
Yeah.
data available to other people to replicate. So people,
See, I have hardly done any experiments.
okay, but you've studied people who have. So
Well, sure, but and I, experimental science is not the only kind of science either. So I,
yes,
my major work has really been what you would call a case study, not an experiment.
but that's
I,
qualitative rather than quantitative science, and that's science.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so do you know your Enneagram, your Myers-Briggs, as a psychologist? I hope you do.
Not really. I did the Myers-Briggs once years ago. It was pretty balanced. I think it was ENTJ or something like that, but
That sounds right.
very close to the opposite. The opposite would be what INFP or something
Yes.
similar, so I guess the N would have been similar, but it was very close to neutral on everything. Well balanced. I've never really looked into the Enneagram.
Okay. You were born in Wisconsin when?
1946.
What's month? I'm asking because of
Oh,
your astrological.
December 4th, 1946 at 1:20 a.m.
So you're a Sagittarian.
I am. Yes, I was born in Fond du Lac.
If anybody wants to look at your chart,
They, yeah.
do you identify with being a Sag?
I do. Yeah. Mhm.
How so?
Well, the Sagittarian is very high-minded person with philosophical interests, ruled by the planet Jupiter. Also, of course, the Sagittarian, half horse, half man, represents a dual nature, those sorts of things. I don't put a lot of stock into it, but
Mm-hmm.
over the years, I've often felt that I've gained many insights from thinking about astrology.
Mm-hmm. You said that you had an awareness of consciousness when you were 10. What was that? I'm asking because I'm interested in your
Oh,
family life.
let's see. Well, at the age of 10 years old, I used to climb up on the rooftop of our house and just sit out there and look around at the neighborhood. And one of the things that I reflected on was, how come I'm me? How am I in this body? How come everybody else is in a different body and I happen to be in this particular one, sitting on this particular rooftop? It seemed like a real intriguing puzzle to me at the time.
And did you come up with any kind of possible answers?
No, I'm still working on it.
How do you define consciousness at this point? I mean, that's the buzzword lately.
Well, yes, it is a buzzword, and I think it's simply the best way to say it is awareness or even experience. It's I think the philosophers have a good word for it. They call it qualia. When you're having an experience of something. It's not about something. It is actually being something.
So does the koi swimming around in my fish pond have qualia?
Why not?
Yeah.
I imagine, I would assume that they do, sure.
Okay. What was your family's attitude towards religion, spirituality when you were growing up?
Very conventional. well, actually, very conventional for a Jewish family living in a small Midwestern town. So by that I mean that Jewish people in the era in which I was raised try very hard to assimilate, to be considered as Americans and not really Jews. It's just like, we're another branch of the Judeo-Christian family, but we're no different than everyone else. That was sort of the big thing to fit in.
Well, you had a Hanukkah bush at Christmas?
No.
You have a menorah and a dreidel?
Yeah, sure. I had a conventional Jewish background, but what I mean by that is there was no discussion of the mystical or well, let's call it the mystical side of Judaism. I only learned about that after I left Fond du Lac.
Got it.
The Judaism is the most rational of all religions.
What about Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism?
That all came later.
Okay.
In fact, quite specifically, it came in 1972 when I had a dream of my great uncle Harry, who was a very pious religious man. He was the president of the Orthodox synagogue in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And I had this dream about him one night, and it was a very powerful dream, so much so that when I awoke from the dream, I was crying and singing at the same time. And I wrote home. I said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." And my mother called me right away, and she said, "How did you know? Uncle Harry just died." And that naturally raised a lot of questions in my mind, like, where'd that dream come from? It was a very powerful dream, and in which Uncle Harry seemed to be talking to me in a very deep way about my life. And so I asked, would you send me some object that Uncle Harry owned so I can remember him? And my aunt wrote back to me with a book. She said, this was Uncle Harry's favorite book. It's a little book. I have it somewhere nearby, but it was in Yiddish, so I had to have it translated. It turned out to be a book called The Tales of the Baal Shem Tov, which was a book of Jewish mysticism from the Hasidic movement. And then I realized that my Uncle Harry was deeply involved in all of that, but he kept it secret because, as I say, Jews were trying to fit in. They didn't want to talk about that side of things. So I only learned about it, as after his death. My Uncle Harry and my grandmother, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. My father's sister, that's not right. My father's mother was Uncle Harry's sister. So he was my great uncle. The two of them had been born in Russia, in an area around the town of Lubavitch, which is where at the time there was a very famous Hasidic rabbi, and they had all studied with that rabbi. They were what today would be called the Lubavitcher Hasidim. But they kept it very hidden.
So you do have it in your ancestral genes, in a way, kind of an interest in the mystical.
Yeah, I would go even further, because now I've learned that I was not the only descendant of Uncle Harry, although I'm not a direct descendant. Other direct descendants of Uncle Harry also had similar dreams around the time of his death.
So he was saying goodbye and getting things organized for his departure. That was very considerate of him.
Yeah.
Were you bar mitzvah?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I had we grew up in what was called a conservative Jewish synagogue, and which is different than Orthodox.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
And yes, but I did. I had a good Jewish education. I loved all the Jewish music, and I had a bar mitzvah in which I not only said the normal blessings that are required for a bar mitzvah, but I actually conducted the entire Friday evening service and large portions of the Saturday morning service. So it was, now that I look back on it, a very healthy Jewish education. But by the time I was 16, I had pretty much rejected all that.
And did you replace it with Buddhism or something else, or you just let it go?
No, I was just, I was young and wild and free and in college and experimenting with drugs. And I developed an interest in religious mysticism because I at that point had a pretty secular, skeptical attitude toward life, and I thought, what's going on with all these crazy people who report that they see ghosts and that they're having mystical experiences? It must be some sort of a psychopathological aberration. So when I was an undergraduate in college, I decided I would write a senior honors thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism. And I figured, there'll be some explanation, like what kind of a psychopathology this is. But as I began my research, I started reading people like Abraham Maslow and William James, and I arrived at the conclusion that there was something actually quite authentic to these experiences, that my initial hypothesis was wrong. And so, plus by that time I was taking LSD and you could say having some pretty powerful experiences of my own, that I decided you couldn't just dismiss these as pathological aberrations. Something else was going on. So all of that happened before I had the dream about Uncle Harry. I had concluded, that mystical experiences were actually a sign of a healthy psychological makeup. But after I began having the dream of Uncle Harry and other precognitive dreams, I was a graduate student at that time in Berkeley in criminology. My interest was clinical psychology, really, but I wanted to enroll in Berkeley, and they had a clinical psychology option available in the School of Criminology. And I found I had studied criminology as an undergraduate, so it seemed like a natural way to enroll at Berkeley, which is a very hard school to get into. Probably wouldn't have been accepted as a psychology major. But I was there in criminology, and I was doing field work at San Quentin prison in the psychiatric unit. We're doing group therapy with murderers and sex offenders. And I decided that what I really wanted to do was explore human deviance, but explore the positive side of human deviance, not the negative side. And there were many, many obstacles to doing that. You could study crime and psychopathology all you want at a school like Berkeley, but they didn't really offer programs in creativity and intuition, and certainly not in parapsychology, which I had developed a real interest in by that time. So, or consciousness, not even consciousness. And although they did have a program at Santa Cruz called The History of Consciousness. But I was having these dreams, and I decided to try and find a way. And actually one day, this would have been in 1972 also, I knew I was going to have a dream. I was agonizing for months and months about how am I going to shift over to this study of positive forms of human deviance. And one day I just knew a dream is going to come that evening and I'll have an answer in the dream. Mm-hmm. And this, after months of very painful, difficult, agonizing, like, how can I do this? And I did, in fact, have a dream that changed my life that night, in which I dreamt I was visiting the home of some friends of mine who lived in Berkeley, across town. And when I knocked on their door, they weren't home. There was no answer. But in the dream, I found the key, let myself in, and walked into their living room in their apartment in student housing, married student housing, and I found a magazine on the middle of the living room floor. So in the dream, I picked up the magazine and I was paging through it when I awoke with this feeling of exhilaration, like, wow, there's the answer. But I didn't have a clue as what it meant. So I acted out the dream. I put on my tennis shoes, because those were the days before running shoes, and I ran across town. We called them sneakers back then. Well, you probably remember. And I went to the apartment, knocked on the door. As I had dreamt, nobody answered. And in fact, I knew where they kept a key, under the doormat. And so I let myself into their apartment, and there in the middle of the living room floor was a magazine, just as I had dreamt. And I picked it up, I started paging through it, just as I had done in the dream. The name of the magazine in my dream was I, E-Y-E, which actually was a magazine that issued a few brief issues back then. But in the actuality, the magazine was named Focus. And it literally brought focus to my life. It was the magazine of listener-sponsored radio and television in San Francisco for KQED. And as I was paging through it, I had the thought that I could pursue my interest by getting involved in the nonprofit, listener-sponsored media, which was a huge shift for me, because at those days I didn't own a radio or a television. In fact, I considered myself I was a long-haired hippie, and I considered any kind of electronic communication to be phony baloney, that the only authentic human interactions were face-to-face. But at that moment, I changed my mind, and I went over to KPFA-FM in Berkeley, where I lived, and even though at that point I had my master's degree, I said, I'm here to volunteer. I'll do whatever you need. And they said, okay, we'll accept you. Sit at this desk here, and when you hear the doorbell ring, press this buzzer so that people can enter. And that was my job. And I was very happy, and I accepted it. And within 3 weeks, I had learned how to produce a radio program, and I actually did one. I did a couple of radio programs. One was about how you don't have to be from out of town to be psychic, because I interviewed a lot of local people who were psychics. And the program director came over to me and said, we have a slot we'd like you to fill every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. There's a program called The Mind's Ear, and we want you to interview people. And so, like that, all of a sudden, I found myself sitting across a table from world-class experts on the subjects that I was most interested in, because everybody passing through San Francisco on a book tour would end up, at KPFA, and I had 10,000 people listening in to my conversations twice a week, and that gave me the confidence to create my own individual, interdisciplinary, doctoral major at Berkeley in parapsychology, using what they had was at the time provisions where if you could find faculty members from different departments who would sponsor an interdisciplinary doctoral major, you could do that.
And Charles Tart probably saved the day for you, right? Because Charles Tart worked with you.
He was one of my committee members, and they all, in a way, saved the day for me, because as I got closer and closer to getting the degree, the professional skeptics, an organization called PsyCop, tried very hard to get the university to actually revoke the degree. I mean, the enormous obstacles were put in front of me. The closer I got to getting the degree, the more obstacles they threw at me. And then after I got the degree, there was a concerted effort by outside skeptics to pressure the university to revoke the degree.
Why do they care? I mean, how did they know, and why do they care?
From the point of view of these skeptics, parapsychology represents the rising tide of superstition. They are very concerned that many irrational beliefs permeate the culture, and the idea, they consider the findings of parapsychology to be impossible because they contradict their own materialistic worldview. At least they believe that to be the case, and they figure any claims of a parapsychological nature are due to error and fraud, and no major university has ever awarded a doctoral diploma in parapsychology. In fact, to this day, 39 years later, I still have the only doctoral diploma that says parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university anywhere in the world. So they believe that such things should never happen.
In talking to different visionary scientists, numerous ones have said they're in debates with skeptics. They say, okay, well, let's talk about a particular case and the methodology. And usually they haven't read them. So they have some sense of the conclusion, but they don't they don't research the methodology, the triple blind studies with outcomes, thousands beyond chance.
That's generally true, because they figure you don't need to study this once you are already convinced that there's nothing to it, that it's all nonsense. Now that's changing. It's changing very, very slowly. But we've got a long, long way to go.
So much of quantum physics, like the quantum physicists have said, is spooky and weird. So if you're 98% empty, that's the truth. But I don't really believe it, because common sense says you're solid. So there's so many aspects, or 95% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. We don't know what it is. So there's so much we don't know to be so sure that what parapsychology says is inaccurate is really arrogant and lazy.
All of that is true, but from their point of view, they would say we now, for hundreds of years, have known that science is quite successful using materialistic metaphysics. We built an atomic bomb that way, so it works. And because technology is all based on materialism, people it's a philosophical error, but they say because it works, it must be an accurate description of all of nature. And so that's the error that they make right there. And most people would make that error. They say, I drive my car, I fly in airplanes, we're surrounded by technology, and it all works so well because of the materialistic metaphysics, that therefore that metaphysical viewpoint is a complete description of all of reality, and we can ignore the rest. Anything that cannot be measured and described using materialism might as well not exist.
Well, then they can throw out quantum physics and non-locality and the observer effect and the interviewer's belief effect and all that. That's why there's no unified field theory, right? Scientists haven't been able to find a theory that combines the little and the big.
And there is a phrase in physics you may have heard some people say, yeah, shut up and calculate. I mean, the calculations work, and you don't need to bother your silly head with philosophical questions that you can never answer, like what does it all mean?
Yeah. How did you get to your TV show, Thinking Aloud and More Thinking Aloud, and are you still doing that show?
Yes. In fact, we just uploaded a new video yesterday with a famous skeptic named James Alcock. And it was a very good conversation, actually. Yeah. I'll be interviewing. That was he has a new book on the psychology of belief, and he has many good points about how people form belief systems, and those belief systems are very powerful. People will murder or even commit suicide based on their beliefs.
Sure.
So it's important that we form accurate beliefs, and I think we agree about that. People should always question the sources of their beliefs. I'm totally in favor of that.
Sure. We want to be skeptics, but not deniers.
Yeah, I'm putting up 3 interviews every week these days.
Wow. And do you do them on Skype, or how do you contact?
Well, I now live in Albuquerque. When I lived in the San Francisco area, or even in Las Vegas, where I lived for 17 years, people are always passing through, so I did not do Skype interviews. I did all live studio interviews, but here in Albuquerque, we have fewer visitors, so I've started doing Skype interviews, and the quality is actually pretty good. Like right now, I can see you. It looks like a high-definition image on my screen.
Right. So you have interviewed hundreds of these people. Do you see any patterns in terms of what makes them courageous enough to go against the dominant materialist paradigm, or their belief systems, or what do you see patterns?
Well, I do think that it takes a certain amount of courage. Not very few people were willing to, do the sort of drastic, unique thing that I did. Most people will pursue a more conventional career, and they get academic positions, and they, kind of make sure that they establish themselves in some other conventional field and don't make too many waves, and maybe when they're emeritus professors, then they can publish in parapsychology, or it depends. Everybody takes a different path. By and large, I would say 95% of the people who explore these areas scientifically do so because, like me, they've had powerful personal experiences. I would say, and the other 5 to 10% who really cannot claim personal experiences do it out of intellectual curiosity.
Jessica Utt is a good example of that, who did the statistics for the remote viewers, I think. That's intellectual.
Yeah, I think so. And doesn't she live near you, near Chico, as I recall?
She used to be at Davis, but now she's in Irvine.
Oh, I see. So she's no longer in Northern California.
Right. Any other patterns that you see in parapsychology innovators?
Well, I guess I could say this. I don't really know the extent to which it's true, but there's something odd about being Jewish. I think, I've discovered that quite a number of prominent people in parapsychology have a Jewish background, but not just in parapsychology. Prominent Buddhist teachers, prominent Sufi teachers, prominent yoga practitioners all seem to come from this Jewish background, and it involves, to a large degree, giving up the conventional orthodox practices of Judaism, but looking for what is the essence of Judaism all about, and exploring that in the spiritual traditions of the world. So I don't know if that's really a trend or a pattern, or if it's unique to Jewish people, because they're mostly non-Jewish people. But I do know that everywhere I seem to go, you find a preponderance of Jewish people. Preponderance maybe isn't even the right word, because Jews are a tiny minority, but they seem to be involved in every kind of cutting edge. Some Jewish people will be prominent in every cutting edge activity in which I've ever been involved.
Yeah, that's interesting. Starting Einstein too. You teach parapsychology to practitioners at the Center for Spiritual Living. What do you teach exactly?
Well, it's just a basic introductory course, largely based on the very first book I wrote in 1975, The Roots of Consciousness. So it's just an overview of the field. And the people at the Centers for Spiritual Living are largely studying to become ministers in the it used to be called the Church of Religious Science. Now it's the Centers for Spiritual Living. And so I figure, anybody engaged in a ministerial practice is going to encounter people who are having, in their communities, having psychic experiences, and they need to be aware of you could say, the database of these experiences. It will help them to counsel those people.
So you don't really teach them how to develop their intuition or something?
No, I don't, not in that course.
You can refer them to my book, Essential Energy Tools, How to Develop Your Clairvoyant and Healing Abilities, because it's how to.
I see.
Let's talk about some of your other books. You did books where you had interviews from Thinking Aloud and New Thinking Aloud. So did you do chapters on the different thinkers?
Well, there's one book that was published back in maybe the late 80s, early 90s, of transcripts of interviews from the original Thinking Aloud series.
That was 1995, Thinking Aloud.
You have the book, huh?
And then you did Psi Development Systems. What is that?
That was actually based on my doctoral dissertation at Berkeley. You see, I wrote 2 books before I graduated. The first one was The Roots of Consciousness, published in 75. And the point of that book was basically the equivalent of, because there weren't courses in parapsychology, that I did all independent study at Berkeley, plus I took the courses required for a degree in psychology. And so I had to find a way to demonstrate to my committee members that I had the basic knowledge required to begin to write a dissertation. And so that's the purpose of writing The Roots of Consciousness. It was an overview. And then I did a dissertation on training psychic abilities. And that was Psi Development Systems. It became published as a book eventually.
What's an example of a skill that's taught in that book? What exactly are you training?
The book was not a training manual. I'm not teaching. The book was, you could say, a historical and sociological and parapsychological analysis of methods for training. And it was divided into 3 sections. One was ancient historical methods, yoga, shamanism, things of that sort. Another chapter were popular methods that you could find in the culture, any number of, Scientology, Silva mind control, transcendental meditation, all made claims about training psychic abilities, plus organizations like the Berkeley Psychic Institute was already active in those days, and many other individual psychics taught courses. And so I wrote about the methods that they used, and I began evaluating them and just looking at all the different components that might go into a system for training psychic abilities, including, what mythologies do they employ, what do they work with, physical exercises, meditational practices, people keeping journals, a wide variety of methodologies. And then the final section dealt with experiments. What methods had actually been tested in the laboratory? And there were a number of experiments on relaxation, meditation, hypnosis, yoga, things of that sort. And I reported the experimental data, and then began to look at, what have we learned from all of that? Well, at the end of the day, really very little, but at least I laid it all out.
If there was a conclusion to that book about how to develop those kind of...
No, there really wasn't, because in order to properly evaluate from an experimental point of view whether any given training program worked, you have to do more than just say, well, they took the training program and after that they scored high on a test of ESP. Even if you score before and after the training program, you still don't know whether the training program, and let's suppose they score higher afterwards, was it the training program that caused the difference, or could it have been something else outside the training program that caused them to score higher afterwards? So none of those experiments had ever been done. There hadn't even been any before and after studies. So all you could say is that, we have quite a bit of research that shows that variety of relaxation methods are conducive to higher scores, but just because you create a condition that's conducive to a higher score, that's not the same as training somebody.
Right.
So at the end of the day, I had to say, we have all of these historical and popular and experimental situations, and we can look at them and evaluate them, and enormous numbers of anecdotal reports. But from the perspective of experimental science, we have yet to learn much. And furthermore, there's an additional problem, because even if you do the most rigorous experiments with very complex methodologies, and I laid out what those need to be, you still have what's known as the experimenter effect in parapsychology, which is that you cannot rule out that some experimenter is using psychokinesis to get the kind of experimental result that would confirm a cherished hypothesis. In fact, that's an absolute limit on what you can accomplish with the experimental method in parapsychology.
Right.
Ultimately.
Like Marilyn Schlitz does an experiment, and the British skeptic does the same thing. He doesn't get results, she does. They do it in his lab, she gets results, he doesn't. So I think that does indicate the experimenter has a huge impact.
Right, exactly. And so that means that what that does is it creates a cloud on every form of what we call process-oriented research in parapsychology, that you never can distinguish, we don't yet know how at least, to distinguish between the confirmation of an experimental hypothesis as opposed to the experimenter themselves influencing the experiment through some form of psi. And not just the experimenter, it could be everybody who reads the experiment or any other experimental participant. It could even include people in the future who will learn about your experiment in the future. So you could say that there's a sense in which, the whole human community is exerting a potential psychokinetic influence on every single experiment, not just in parapsychology, but if you accept the data of parapsychology, on every other experiment in virtually every other field of science, certainly the social sciences and psychology in particular. Well, that's a rather dramatic conclusion, but really I came around to that way of thinking, which really meant for me at the end of the day that, a lot of good experimenters are still doing experimental research, and they're very much aware of this problem. And they figure, well, if the data gets replicated in enough different laboratories under enough different circumstances, maybe then we can rely on it. And the same token, it strikes me that we can learn just as much from field studies as we can from experiments. And naturally, and we do. Field studies are a very important source of information about what's going on, but the hardcore skeptics will point out reasons why you can never trust a field study.
A field study like the remote viewers going out?
No, those are experiments. A field study would be, like I wrote, my third book was a 10-year investigation of a man named Ted Owens.
The PKK man.
Yeah, that's right. So that would be an example of a qualitative field study, which is basically the whole methodology was well established in the 19th century by the Society for Psychical Research. And it's still a very valuable methodology. But what you can use the experimental method for, with perfect legitimacy, it's not to do process-oriented research, but rather to determine how strong psi abilities are. What is the strongest effect that we can show in the laboratory? That's perfectly valid because regardless of the source of the psi, or regardless of the process that you're trying to elucidate, the strength is an independent measurement. And I think we would do very well to do whatever we can to increase the strength, because that seems to be the big problem that people have accepting the data, that it's so weak and sporadic, and it doesn't seem to be under conscious control very much. And by, showing that we can increase the robustness of the phenomena, I think the field will make more progress.
The PKK man could change weather at will and manifest UFOs. Did you see him do those kind of amazing things?
I see, not necessarily directly in front of my eyeballs. I didn't see it that way. But and incidentally, it's PK, not PKK.
Ah, thank you.
But what he would do is he would send me letters. We were in different cities most of the time. And he would say, I'm going to do a demonstration. So I would get a letter from him postmarked in which he said, this is what I plan to do. And then afterwards, he would collect newspaper clippings because he was looking at large-scale events that would be reported in the newspapers. And he would predict things that you would not expect, like heat waves in the middle of winter, or cold spells in the middle of summer, or movements of tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanoes, earthquakes, power blackouts, things of that sort. And then he'd send me the newspaper clippings. So mostly that's how I was able to validate what he did.
Did he say how he was able to do it or to summon
Well,
UFOs?
different stories at different times. Sometimes he claimed that he was in telepathic contact with invisible beings from other dimensions. He called them the space intelligences, and that they had all these powers, and he just sent them a telepathic message, and then they would do everything. At other times, he said it was his own psychokinesis. So it's hard to say what was really going on. Again, that's a process-oriented question. But the fact of the matter is that you could compare what he said he was going to do with what actually happened. And I would say, as I did in the book, roughly 2/3 of the time, unusual events that you would not expect to occur did in fact occur.
So they're way beyond probability. So
I would think so, but and nobody has ever disputed that, but I never published any mathematical analysis because honestly, we're dealing with real life situations like that. It was too difficult to do.
In the alpha interface, you talk about predicting the financial markets, and I know that some of the remote viewers did that with the silver market, and Gary Schwartz did it with the stock market. Were you a part of those teams?
Gary Schwartz?
I mean, Stephen Schwartz, sorry.
Stephen Schwartz, yeah. I did some studies like that. They didn't work out particularly well. But I was not part of anybody else's team.
Well, what did you come up with in the alpha interface?
Well, it was mostly in those books. In that phase of my life, I was really looking at conventional researchers in the field of economics and business who were doing studies relating to the financial markets. So I put together a series of 3 books looking at research, published empirical research that would be relevant for people who were traders, because I was actually doing a lot of stock market and futures trading myself. So,
may I ask how it worked for you?
Which?
Your successes in the market?
Well, I had some huge successes and I had some huge failures. I suppose all in all, I came out slightly ahead. I'm living a very comfortable lifestyle, so something must have worked. And I certainly didn't earn very much money doing parapsychology. So, I work with neural networks, for example, artificial intelligence, and it's still a big interest of mine. The use of artificial intelligence in forecasting financial futures.
And are the AIs better than human forecasters?
Well, I can't say that for sure, but the thing about you see, how can I put it? In the world of trading and investing, you have people who seem to be very highly intuitive, very gifted, and they don't work with any rules or principles other than their own intuition. In fact, often if you try to get them to explain how they do it, they can't explain it very well for that reason. Or maybe it's just too unconscious on their part. I don't know. And then you have a lot of people who work with artificial intelligence. And my biggest successes came from artificial intelligence, not from my...
Because they can gather so much data.
Yeah, yes. Neural networks and other forms of artificial intelligence can see things. I mean, the very notion of a neural network is to try and get a computer system to emulate what researchers think the brain might be doing. And so they can process a lot of data and see patterns that most humans won't be able to see. And sometimes they're very successful. I was extremely successful at one period in my life. I took a $50,000 trading account, and in 6 months it was worth $350,000. So, but when market conditions change, then you have to be able to change and adapt and keep up with that. And people who work in the field of artificial intelligence these days are still trying to figure out how to keep up with the markets, because the markets are like a living system. They're always changing based on information. You've got maybe 1 million or more participants who are always learning and studying and observing and changing constantly, depending upon, political, social, economic factors.
The president's tweets.
Yeah, all of that, yeah.
What's your next project? What's your next book, your next thing that you want to learn about?
Really, it's the video channel, the New Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube. It's taking up all of my activity now. I think, the biggest obstacle that people working in this field face is that there's almost no funding. There's almost no opportunity for support by the universities or philanthropic institutions, the foundations. The skeptics have managed to, through the use of the horse laugh as their weapon, prevent very much funding from coming this way. And so I think the most important thing I can do right now is to put into the public conversation dialogues with the most thoughtful people I can come up with, who are doing the scientific research and the philosophical and theoretical work to support that scientific research. That's, I think, why you're writing this particular book right now, too.
Yes.
So I think it's very important that this is done.
Yes. The organizations that are doing this kind of research, you mentioned that you were involved in the Intuition Network. What is that?
The Intuition Network really no longer exists as a formal organization. At one time it was, and we got a lot of funding from an inventor named Buck Charlson, who lived in Minneapolis, and he invented power steering. And he invented the hydraulic motor. So he built up a small fortune through his inventions, and he was a highly intuitive person, and he wanted to kind of return. He felt his inventions were the result of intuition, and he wanted to return something back to the field of intuition. So he supported us for a number of years, and the purpose was to help create a world in which everybody felt encouraged to cultivate and apply their own inner intuitive abilities. But after the funding ran out, we decided we don't need a formal organization any longer. We can keep it going informally. And even to this day, we have email discussion groups for people who are working professionally in the field of intuition as researchers, teachers, writers, trainers, consultants. And it's largely at this point a self-organizing mutual support network for those people. You would be more than welcome to participate, given your background.
Is there a link for that, or how does someone?
I have to add you to an email discussion list. If you're interested, I can do that.
Yeah, I am. Thank you. Also,
Okay.
You teach at the University of Philosophical Research, which used to be the Philosophical Research Society in LA.
Well, that's not quite accurate. First of all, I'm no longer affiliated with them. And secondly, the University of Philosophical Research has always been a separate organization from the Philosophical Research Society.
Oh.
but but it was an outgrowth of the Philosophical Research Society.
But they're both still functioning?
They're both still functioning, to my knowledge, in Los Angeles. The organization was originally founded by Manly Palmer Hall, who was a metaphysical writer.
Right. I have some of his books.
Mm-hmm.
The California Society for Psychical Study, I don't know about that either.
Yeah, I was a president of that society. When I first got interested in parapsychology, I joined that society. They used to hold monthly meetings in Berkeley. I don't know whether they're still active because I moved out of the Bay Area back in, when did I move? 2001. So it's been a long time since I've lived in California.
So what organizations do you think are doing the most cutting edge research? IONS?
Well, Dean Radin at IONS is doing very important work. There's also the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, is doing very good work. And in England, there, quite a number of universities in England are actually sponsoring parapsychology work.
Like Edinburgh.
Yes, Edinburgh, and now quite a number of others as well. And Edinburgh, you can actually, well, you can earn a doctoral degree. You won't get a diploma like mine that says parapsychology. The diplomas out of Edinburgh and the other English universities will be in psychology, which is perfectly appropriate. I think my emphasis is a little different than that of most psychologists, but because I think parapsychologists need to pay attention to thousands of years of history and philosophy and in spiritual disciplines, but you won't get that by studying psychology. But other than that, those are pretty good programs, and there are dozens of people now in the United Kingdom who are doing parapsychology research and teaching parapsychology and sponsoring dissertations in parapsychology, far more than we have today in the United States.
What do you do, just a couple more questions, what do you do for fun in the face of all your work?
I like karaoke.
Could you give us an example?
You know what? I actually posted a couple of videos of myself singing karaoke. They're, if you want, I'll send you a link.
Please.
Okay.
And what else? But for fun.
I like to hike. I love being outdoors and the wilderness areas, and where I live here in New Mexico, and in fact where I lived in California and in Nevada, there was always wonderful outdoor scenery and vistas to go explore.
Do you ever go to Ojo Caliente, which is my favorite hot springs?
Oh, I've been there. Yeah, it's north of Santa Fe, sure.
Yeah, on the way to Taos. And last question is, in the face of Trump and all the Trump clones around the world and the climate disasters, are you optimistic or pessimistic that we'll find our way out of that mess?
Well, I am naturally an optimist, but my own personal belief, for what it's worth, is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. In fact, I'm sure if you're following the news, you know we're heading right into a crisis right now, and I think it's going to get a lot worse.
Just in terms of the standoff over the silly wall? Well,
you see, what it's really turning into is an opportunity for Trump to declare an emergency and therefore to garner unto himself emergency powers and to try and use them to, well, who knows what he'll do with emergency powers, but he's itching for them. I can see that, and he will, if he could, he would do what other dictators do around the world, and that's very frightening. And I think he's going to push as hard and as far as he can.
Thank God the Democrats won the House in this election. That could save us.
Well, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough to save us from what might yet come.
Did we leave anything imperative out that you would like to make sure is in your chapter or your video?
Oh, let me think. Well, there's always so much more that we could talk about, but I think you're off to a good start. If you have follow-up questions, let me know. And of course, in terms of other people you might want to include in your book, if you go, I don't know if you found the page where I list all the interviews in the New Thinking Aloud series.
Yes.
You have that. So there are many other people I've interviewed who might be appropriate for you.
Absolutely. I'll check that one again. I will let you go. Thank you. I will get the transcript to you later, and I'll get the video link today.